Hi, and welcome to Journey Forward with Jory Rose, where you will gain insights, tools, and inspiration to get unstuck and live your best life. Jory is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a passion for helping people cultivate awareness and authenticity so they can show up fully in all aspects of their life. And now, here's Jory.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Journey Forward with Jory Rose. I'm really excited to have Sara Schairer here today, who we have known each other for years. We were just talking about how long it has been, and I'm so grateful that she's taken some time this morning to be on the show with us. Sara, introduce yourselves and tell everyone what it is that you do and how do you show up in the world?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. And it is just such a pleasure to see you and connect with you again. I am Sara Schairer, and I'm the founder and executive director of the nonprofit organization Compassionate, which sounds like the word compassionate, but it's actually two words, compassion, it, making compassion a verb, kind of like just do it or Google it. So we offer compassion trainings.
I love it.
For people of all walks of life all over the world, from big tech leaders to inmates in maximum security prisons, to educators and nonprofit leaders. So we do recognize that compassion is needed in every facet of society. So we try to get to as many places as we can with our work.
Sara, I love it. And you and I met years ago. We were trying to figure out 7, 8, maybe even longer. I don't even know when, at the Wisdom 2.0 conference in San Francisco. And I still have my original compassionate swag. As we were just saying, I've got a tote bag. I think I've got the shirt you're wearing. I've got the bands, the bracelets, the plastic bracelets. And I remember very distinctly getting the bracelets, and in the package, and I'm sure it's still this way, in the package, there are 2 of them. Yeah. And I remember you saying that the first act of compassion is to give one away.
Yeah. So we should explain the wristband.
Yes,
is
please.
Unique because it's like a Live Strong kind of band, right? But it's black on one side and white on the other. And it reads compassion it on it. And when you do an act of compassion or you compassion it, you flip it from one side to the other. So it's an actual tangible reminder and like a little reward for doing your compassionate act. And they come in pairs so that you wear one and share one. And yes, that first act of compassion is to find someone to give the other wristband to. And then you have a friend in compassion and you all can say, oh, did you flip your wristband today? What'd you do?
I love it.
Fun.
So there's so much I want to get into around how you do the work that you do, especially I'm really curious with the inmates, and we'll get there. And how did you get into this practice to build this as your business and this nonprofit? What's your story? How did you arrive at compassion being the thing that you needed to share with the world?
It is a crazy story. It came out of as a lot of ideas do, came out of the most difficult time of my life.
Of course.
It was back in 2008, and I was going through an unwanted divorce. My daughter was only a year and a half old, and I had quit my career to be home with her. And in 2008, there were no jobs. It was the economic fallout.
Yeah.
So I couldn't find a job. I was depressed and anxious. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I mean, I had my life planned out, and this was not part of the plan. And I did not know how to cope. Something like this had never really happened to me. I spent time when she was a baby on the couch watching daytime television while she was while they nap a lot when they're little like that. And so I remember distinctly that there was an Ellen episode that I watched, and she was interviewing Wayne Dyer, and he was talking about compassion. And he said, compassion is the most important lesson to teach our kids.
Wow.
He's like, yeah, we need to teach them math and reading and stuff. But if we could teach our children compassion, we would solve every social problem on the planet. That's the solution. And I had never thought about compassion in that way before. I didn't realize how powerful it was. And I could not stop thinking about it. And that very night, the word compassionate appeared just as you see it on the wristbands and on the t-shirts, compassion it. And I was like, oh, that's clever. That's cool. That could
That's
be
so
like,
good.
yeah, that could be a bumper sticker, right? I saw it as like the next coexist, thinking, oh, compassionate. That's clever. It's like, just do it. So I Googled it thinking like, well, probably somebody's already thought of this, but if they hadn't done anything with it. So I started the process for trademarking stickers. And then I did nothing with it for 3 years. I just kept postponing that trademark and getting my own life back on track. It really took me about that long. And in the meantime, I was practicing this in my own life. And I realized,
was just going to
wow,
ask, just going to ask that very same thing, that as you were waiting for it to get to the next stage in a career sort of way, how were you embodying it as a practice? And had you ever really practiced compassion before?
No, well, my parents had raised me to be a good human. So I think I've been compassionate throughout my life, but I didn't quite understand what it was until I now had this sort of new obsession with it. And I began to compassion it in my daily life. And I realized, wow, things just go a lot better with compassion. So whether it was working through something with my ex, or a challenging customer, or maybe if my boss seemed to be grouchy, when I brought compassion into the mix, I realized things were much better, and having compassion for myself too. And so I realized this is a very powerful little phrase, and I need to get this out there, because if something happens to me, if I die, this could die. And this is something people need to see. So I started making stickers at the end of 2011. In 2012, that turned into these wristbands. That became viral because someone sent their extra wristband to a YouTuber in England who had hundreds of thousands of followers on her YouTube channel. So literally, we became a global movement overnight in 2012. And in the meantime, I just got obsessed with compassion and found out that Stanford has a Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. And they had developed an 8-week course to help people cultivate compassion for themselves and others. And they were looking for teachers of that course. And somehow I got in the very first cohort to learn how to teach that course. It was a year-long training through Stanford. And that began in the fall of 2012. And I've been teaching compassion ever since.
Wow. What a story. I mean, it's that beautiful, kind of story arc of turning your mess into your message, right? And really turn your pain into your purpose. I mean, I hate the cliches, and yet they're so true.
Totally.
And I actually think they are really authentic when it comes from that place that is so personal to us. And that authenticity to be able to share with any potential clients or students or whomever you're working with, I think just makes this practice so much richer. I mean, anything I think in the contemplative field as a teacher and educator of these tools, if you're not embodying it and you lack that authenticity, I have a high intolerance for inauthentic contemplative teachers. That's one of my biases, right?
Of course.
And so it feels that you really delved all the way in, both from a personal practice, from a training. So let's get to some of the basics, because I know some listeners may get it conceptually. Yeah, to be compassionate, to be kind. How do you define what it means to have compassion? And I always like to, because I've got some definitions, so I would like to kind of see if they align or not. And I also like to put it on the continuum of sympathy and empathy, because I think people sometimes inaccurately interchange certain words when they're actually quite different. So let's kind of get to that bottom line, and maybe we can build from there, so we get everyone having a common understanding. So how do you define compassion?
Well, I'll take a minute to answer this, because I'd like to first start off by saying that at its Latin roots, compassion means to suffer with. So when we are compassionate, we are able to be present in the midst of suffering. We're not running away from it. We're not pretending we don't see it, which is what we do very well in our society.
Yes. A lot of distractions. It's really easy to pretend it's not there.
Totally. We also don't get overwhelmed in the midst of suffering. We are able to stay there with suffering and stay present. So that's a big part of compassion. And we're using this word suffering, which in our society, we think suffering is this terrible, terrible thing, right? Like and that word, when we talk about it, we're using a very expansive definition of the word suffering.
And I'm glad you say that, because, in the roots of, mindfulness practice as defined in Buddhist meditation practice, it's all around how do we reduce our suffering, right? And I've always struggled with the word suffering. So I'm glad that you're bringing this up. And I know I've mentioned it before in the podcast, but I think it's really fitting to insert here, because the word suffering can sometimes make people feel like their problems aren't big enough to qualify it being suffering. And if I really think about suffering, like my mind goes to like the Holocaust, and if I like that's suffering, right? And if I'm just having a bad day, and if I compare it to that level of suffering, well, then I'm not going to give any credit to my bad day. So I always like to say there's no hierarchy in suffering.
Right. Well,
and my suffering is going to look different than yours, but doesn't make it any better suffering or worse suffering. Like,
right.
So it's a very qualitative word.
It is. And so the way that my teachers taught it to me is that suffering is whenever there's a gap between where you are and where you want to be. So if you want something you can't get, or you get something you don't want. If you want something you can't get, or you get something you don't want, you're suffering. So if you're not just one of those lucky people that's just content all the time in this moment, you're suffering. And so any kind of worry or concern,
love that definition. I've never heard it as that. I love that, because that makes people can truly, like, I feel like it's a visceral definition. Like I can feel that there's that gap somewhere that I'm not fully aligned. Either it's out of my power, I didn't choose this, or even if maybe I did choose something, because I could say, when I got divorced, I'm the one who wanted it, and yet it was still suffering.
Of course.
Even if it was by my choice per se, right? As opposed to what you were saying, yours was an unwanted decision there. And so we can even choose things that still put us into suffering. It's not always done to us.
No, and really most of us are suffering most of the time.
Yeah.
Because if we're worried about, there's something we're concerned about, or we wish wasn't happening, but is, and it's the human condition, right? As we are taught. So it's kind of good news and bad news, right? Like everybody's suffering. That sounds terrible. But the good thing is that that's something we all have in common, right? So I can connect with everybody around suffering. And it means every single person I encounter is someone who I can offer my compassion to, because it doesn't matter what it is, they're probably suffering in some way. And I can't tell from what's happening on their face if they're suffering or not. With this expansive definition of suffering, I know, if you're worried about something, and you probably are, because most of us are stressed about something going on, I can offer my compassion to you. And what does that mean? I can just be present and warm and have an ear for listening for you without trying to fix or solve problems, right? Or relate it back to myself. I can just be present with you and know that you are struggling in some way.
Yeah. There's something so powerful you said in what you just said, which is, and not relate it back to myself, which is, I think, a loop that many people think is being compassionate by identifying with someone suffering and sharing an experience that they think relate to let the other person understand that I feel you. And in fact, being on the receiving end of that, I never feel seen when someone brings it back to themselves. Ever. It actually just feels like, wait, you just kind of took the baton and now we're running my own race of my own suffering.
Yeah, we practice.
It's a hard practice.
It's hard. We practice it a lot in the classes that I teach, and the practice is just to keep your mouth shut. It's we do it in a very extreme way. I think some people call it active listening too, but you don't say a word back to the person during the exercises we do. And it really, when you do that for the first time, you recognize your normal tendencies.
Oh,
like,
yes.
oh, wow, I would normally have said this, or I would have reacted in this way, or I would have tried to offer a solution. And when you are forced to not say anything back, you realize, wow, that's what I normally do. And what's cool is if you're the one sharing a stress or your concern with someone who's not saying anything back, you feel heard.
You know what? I love that you shared that, because it's something people can practice without even being guided in it.
Yeah.
Right. They can just take this invitation to say, let me, next time I'm listening to somebody, let me just take note on what are my thoughts? What are my habits? What are my patterns? Do I tend to interrupt? Do I tend to want to ask questions? Do I tend to interject my own suffering and thinking that's in alignment with them? And if I can just be quiet and just listen, it's huge. I've done similar exercises in mindfulness classes. And there was one time this woman, I would always ask them afterwards, did you feel seen? Did you feel heard? And 100% of the people would say, yes, I've actually never felt more heard by having this nonverbal, recipient on the other end. And one woman said to me, she goes, and she was in her, I think, early 60s. She said, that was the first time in my entire life I haven't been interrupted. She said that was worth the price of admission on its own.
Wow.
But like we are always interjecting, and really to just be with is more than enough.
And it's skillful to say, if it's a good friend of yours, or maybe your partner or someone, or even your child, say, okay, do you want me just to listen, or am I problem solving for you? Like, let me know what you need right now, so that you can go into it knowing your role. Because maybe somebody's asking you for advice, but don't offer it if you don't know, right?
Yes.
I think that's a good rule of thumb. Like, would you like for me to offer some pointers, or do you just want a listener today? I can just listen.
And I think that's a great thing to also request before you start speaking. So, right, you can say that as the listener, but even as the speaker, if it's to your friend or your partner or a coworker or even your child, say, hey, you know what, I want to share, and I actually don't need any advice. I would just really love for you just to listen.
Yep. Beautiful.
So we can also practice putting it out there as an intention. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I love it.
So with compassion, go ahead.
Hold on. I still haven't actually defined compassion.
I was just going to ask.
We just sort of got around it. Okay.
I know.
So
I was going to
will
say,
share
with compassion, what is the actual practice definition beyond the suffering?
Yeah. So the definition that we use in the course that I teach from Stanford, which is called Compassion Cultivation Training, it starts with recognizing suffering. So it's a cascade of events that begins with recognizing suffering, which makes sense, right? Like, I have to see that you are suffering in order for me to be compassionate. I also need to, or if it's self-compassion, like, I need to take a moment and recognize that I'm suffering, right? So that I can be compassionate, which is where mindfulness comes in, because if we're not present, we can't see the suffering. Right. If my head is buried in my phone, or if my mind is just all over the place, I'm not going to know that you need something. Right. So learning how to be present offers the opportunity to recognize suffering, which kicks off this cascade of compassion, because after we recognize suffering, this is when empathy begins. So we then may actually automatically, without thinking, feel what the other is feeling. This visceral reaction. There's a theory that we have mirror neurons in our brains that allow us to feel what another person is feeling. So let's say if you see me slam the door on my toe and it rips off my big toenail, it would hurt you too, probably. You could probably feel that pain in your toe.
Right.
And that's because of these mirror neurons, right? So that's empathy. When you're feeling, it doesn't even have to be pain. It can be joy of another too. So feeling what another is feeling, that can happen automatically, or you may have to use your imagination and say, I wonder what it might be like to be you right now. And
so to have that curiosity.
Yeah. So you can get at empathy either viscerally, like automatically, or it can be more of a cognitive empathy, where you're thinking like, okay, I can get where you're coming from. I can get how you're feeling.
I can
All right, so
imagine
then,
that to be true.
Yeah. And then after empathy, we have this desire to help. It's just this innate desire that bubbles up. We're all born with this. And then with compassion, we have a willingness to act. We want to take action to alleviate that suffering. And as we talked about before, it doesn't have to be this huge elaborate thing. It can just be, really, most of the time, you just need to be present with the person. And then what's cool with compassion is the byproduct of compassion. At the end of it, you get this warm glow in your heart space, usually, or sometimes it's all over your body. But compassion feels really good. It's energizing. It's a very positive feeling. And that's why when people talk about compassion fatigue, that's actually, there's no such thing, because compassion gives us energy. That's more like empathy fatigue or empathic distress. If all you're doing is feeling what another is feeling, that's not compassion, right? But when you are able to do something to support the person, that energizes you and makes you feel good.
And it's an interesting question. I've never considered that compassion fatigue under those definitions may not really exist. And yet we can also get tired from taking care of others.
Well, okay. So we also need to recognize that self-compassion has to be a part of this mix too.
Right.
So attuning to self while I'm attuning to you. So if I'm practicing compassion, I'm not ignoring what my body is doing, right? So if I'm taking care of myself while I take care of you, then that is a renewable resource. We're never going to run out of that.
So that's a really, really great acknowledgement that if we're truly practicing, the self piece is innately part of that cycle.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, compassion fatigue there's no such thing.
I love that.
You have to include yourself.
And a couple of years ago, I led a women's retreat. I do them yearly, minus the COVID years. And one of the years I focused on self-compassion as a practice, because I see in so many of the women, the majority of my clients are women, majority of them are mothers. And I find that self-compassion is one of the hardest practices for women, especially. I know everyone. And in the population that I work a lot with, it feels that they've never been given permission to practice self-compassion, that it feels selfish to have self-care, to put yourself anywhere, not first, but to put your own needs in that cycle of caring for others feels outside of the martyrdom that much of women believe what it means to be a good mom or a good wife or whatever. And it's a really, really hard practice to engage. And I've often found, and I'm curious if you find the same thing, for many people, it's easier to be compassionate towards others than it is towards yourself.
Yeah.
So
and
what would you say to that?
That comes up a lot when I teach, and we focus a lot on self-compassion because it's something that we aren't taught. Most of us aren't taught this from a young age. It's not modeled for us. And it's relatively sort of this new concept. So it's mind-blowing once you realize it, right? I mean, this is something that will change your life if you can begin to practice it. And I remember learning about it, and one of the components of self-compassion is self-kindness. And I remember one of my teachers saying, think about the way you speak to yourself. If you spoke to any of your friends the way you speak to yourself, would you have any?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I would never say the things to my friends that I say to myself, never in a million years. And that was a huge light bulb moment for me, because I thought, well, that is insane. Why would I speak to myself this way? And realizing that I don't need to be hard on myself in order to achieve and to have a successful life. In fact, I need to be kind and supportive to myself and treat myself like a coach or mentor. So when you recognize that, I think, of course, as always, awareness is key, right? Realizing like, wow, that inner critic, boy, she is a you know what, I got to tone that
Yeah.
down. How can I change that to a coach who encourages me instead of berating me for every mistake?
Yeah.
And then also this idea with self-compassion, that realizing I'm not alone.
Yeah.
Which we talked about, suffering is universal, but you know, especially if you're ever on social media, it's like, wow, everybody has this amazing life and they're living their like best quarantine, COVID, you know, all these vacations and whatever. And I'm suffering over here on my couch in the same four walls. Why is life hard for me and not for anyone else? And when we step back and realize, oh, that's right, I'm actually not alone. A lot of people are having a hard time. That's comforting. It's really comforting to know. And it's important for all of us to recognize, I don't know, just how much pain others are in.
Yeah. I often, to that common humanity piece, I often will say, well, you are unique, your problems are not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really, you know, people want to feel connected, but they also want to feel, but I'm also, but no one else is me, right? So there's that paradox of
So true.
whatever I'm feeling is just part of being human, and being human is hard. And my exact dynamics or scenarios, yes, that is unique to me, but this as a human experience, this is not the first time anyone's ever felt this. And that's, I think, where people increase their own suffering, is they think something's wrong with me.
Yeah.
It's like, no, if, you know, if you really just are open to listening, maybe to others, or being open to seeing others differently, you might recognize we're actually more alike than we're different.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then I've added sort of another element to self-compassion that we talk about in our trainings, and that's this need to reach out for support. So I think sometimes people think with self-compassion, it means like, okay, this is on me. I'm going to take care of myself and tend to myself. And I think a very important part is to realize when you need help, and that it's okay to reach out to your community for support, or a therapist, right? Because we do need each other. So self-compassion doesn't mean you have to go it alone.
Absolutely. I also, in some of the work that I've done with compassion with my clients, is I think it's a really, really integral piece, is to also, sometimes the most self-compassionate act you can do is to draw some really healthy boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if we look at kind of some of those core definitions of Kristen Neff, of, you know, mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness, it is a kind act to draw boundaries. Because I sometimes have talked to women who've been in abusive situations, and they can be speaking really kind to themselves. They can know that they're not alone in this experience, and they can be present and aware and mindful of it, and still stay stuck in a toxic situation. And so I often, when you look at compassion being a verb, as you said, I sometimes think, okay, sometimes that awareness of those three components in and of itself isn't enough to actually get ourselves unstuck. So whether it's, you know, like you said, that taking the step of reaching out to others, or to draw a boundary to say, I no longer have to engage in a certain relationship or dynamic. And it's easier said than done, which is why we've got to even be compassionate to that process of being self-compassionate, right? Like, it's this ongoing cycle.
Yeah. Well, people often think compassion is this very soft, like, oh, you're going to be able to walk all over me because I'm compassionate. And compassion actually is fierce. I mean, it takes courage to care about myself and others. The most compassionate people are very courageous people. I mean, if you think about leaders, you know, or people in our past that we think of as the most compassionate, boy, they were strong and courageous. So compassion is not this soft skill that allows people to walk all over you. When you're compassionate, you are taking care of yourself and people you care about. And that takes strength.
So I could talk to you for so long about all of this, because this fires me up. This gets me excited because I love connecting with others who are living their work and living their, you know, intentions and their purpose with this. But I really am curious, how did you get involved in doing this, like in the prison system, and how has that worked? Because that would very much seem like a population that would have barriers to compassion. And that's an assumption, right? So speak a little bit to that, of what your experience has been and what you see as a result of working with inmates. And
So
are you working with both men and women?
Yeah. So I had the opportunity, it's been, I guess, a few years since I've worked at the prison here in San Diego with men. And we started off with, we do a 30-day challenge that helps people, like, each week of the month is dedicated to a different component of compassion. And we introduced that. We've done that a couple times at Donovan. And one time I went in and I led classes on each week's topic for the group. And then I've also gone and taught the 8-week course for some of the inmates there. And these are people who have volunteered to come to my class. Okay. So it's not like they're being forced to take it. So already you're getting, some special people who want to cultivate that, because, man, compassion takes courage, but compassion in prison really takes courage.
Wow. Yeah. I could see a lot of backlash happening there if they're not careful.
Exactly. So it's not a place where people are very kind to one another. And that's out of survival.
Sure.
A need for survival. So I can honestly say that my experience with them has just made me a much better human and compassion teacher, because I recognize when you hear, we've all heard this before, but I've firsthand heard the stories of these men, their life stories, and what brought them to where they are. And you know what? I would have been there too if that had been my past.
Yeah.
I can honestly say that. And I had men who had murdered people in my class, and they'd been in prison for decades. These very warm-hearted, big-hearted guys that have been there for so long. And they really are just dedicating themselves to self-development and trying to be better humans. And it is, boy, if I would have been friends with any of them, or I would hire any of them if I, had the funds to hire people and they were out. They are incredible, amazing human beings. And I've also led my class a few times at the women's jail here in San Diego, which has also been a very powerful and wonderful experience for me. And it also helps them create bonds so that they can support each other in a really stark place, and have the skills to connect with their families that they've had to leave behind. And, in those situations, the women are closer to getting out than a lot of the men I was with. I don't know that they had any idea if or when they would be able to get out. But these are the types of skills that you can take back out into the world and really thrive.
Well, and what even, this is the reciprocity of compassion, right? They are learning these skills, but look how what you just described, how it has softened you to people who we might not otherwise think I have anything in common with, or could I understand them as a human being? And at the end of the day, you have a deep understanding of how they got where they are. And many people don't give themselves the opportunity to create that acceptance or the awareness or just the openness to say, I'm not going to judge you based on the surface level, because it's really easy to do. And I always say, compassion is the opposite of judgment. And when you can be open to considering, how did this person get to where they are? What's their story? What were their circumstances that I would have otherwise have no idea of? Because at the end of the day, they're likely hurt and have had an extreme level of suffering and didn't have skills to know otherwise. I don't want to reduce it down so simply, because I know it's a very complex dynamic, and that human point of connection, I can imagine for you, is huge.
Well, and we talk about this in my class too, that it comes from nonviolent communication, and it's that any unskilled behavior comes from an unmet need. Yeah. And that unskilled behavior is a pretty expansive phrase, right? But that can be road rage or murdering someone, frankly. So, what the unmet needs are just, once you hear about those, it's very easy to have compassion, very easy. And then also,
I love that phrase, Sarah. Any unskilled behavior comes from an unmet need. I love that.
Isn't that beautiful?
It's
I'm
so
not
simple.
taking credit. Yeah, I think
no, but I
think
will.
It's like Marshall. I think it's Marshall Rosenberg's quote, but not quite exactly. I don't.
But it's good enough.
Something
so
similar
we'll
to
still
that.
credit Marshall. And Sarah said, according to Marshall from NBC.
Like
yeah. But it's just so succinct. I think because as I hear it, I just stop and I'm like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
But then to see, I mean, I experienced a lot of heartache doing that work, because especially in the maximum security prison where the guys are held, to see the way that they are treated, you just can see that oftentimes they're not viewed as humans, and we know they're not in our society, right? We put them far away. We don't treat them as if they're human beings, and that is just heartbreaking to witness.
Yeah. It's really, really important work. And I know you and I both done work in education, and I've also done some mindfulness training in the corporate world. And I don't think there's any sector of life that can't benefit from these skills. It supersedes every single, sector, right? There's not one aspect of life that we can't learn from in being more compassionate, more aware, more kind, more present. Yeah. And it's an interesting thing. I remember, times in my life in which I've struggled in, whether it was after my divorce or in just relationship with, family members or, friends that maybe I was having difficult times with. And our mind, as we know, that negativity bias goes right to the judgment. We get pulled into what the negative is. We get pulled into those old narratives, into, the stories that kind of keep us stuck because it's familiar. It's easier to do that than it is to get out of it. And whenever I have the awareness, because to me, mindfulness comes down to just awareness, right? Can I just have that moment of awareness that I'm stuck here? And I know firsthand over the years that when I can truly shift from judging to compassion, it may not change anything with the other person, but it 100% changes me.
Yeah.
And it's going to change how I show up. It's going to change how I relate, how I communicate. The thoughts in my mind, the pit in my stomach goes away, and it's a game changer. And it's,
chances are, I'll just say, chances are, when you change yourself and you begin to act in that way, maybe even toward this person who challenges you, right? Something will shift there.
Yeah.
Something will shift. At some point, you'll notice that interaction is easier, not just because of you changing, but they will pick up on that and also begin to act differently. I've seen it 1,000 times.
Yeah. I love it, Sarah. Like I said, I could talk with you for hours. If people want to learn more about Compassion It, or get any of your awesome bracelets or shirts, how do they find you? What's the best way to connect?
Our website is compassionit.com. So the 2 words, compassionit.com.
I love it. Any final tips if someone is really feeling stuck on getting started that they could do right now as they're listening, as we finish this episode, and they're really wanting to be able to get to that place that you and I are describing, where they can kind of quiet down the judgments and increase the kindness? What would be a simple place that they can right now begin?
I think 3 deep breaths for yourself, and maybe a hand on the heart. So a little kindness toward yourself. I think that's the best place to start.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for helping start my day.
My pleasure.
In a compassionate place. I am so glad that after all these years that we've stayed connected, and I love just supporting and watching what you're doing. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing in this world. It's so needed, and you are such a beautiful soul to be doing it. So thank you.
Thank you. And likewise, this has been great. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, everyone, I hope that you learned some great tools and insights on how to bring more compassion to yourself and those around us. And I hope everyone just take care and be well.
To continue your journey forward, find Jory Rose on Facebook and Instagram to become part of her growing community. You can also gain access to her meditations, books, online classes, or to sign up for an upcoming retreat, visit her at joryrose.com. That's JOREEROSE.com.